The story of women's rights in America is a story of slow, hard-won progress. From the nation's founding, women were often seen as second-class citizens. Their lives were confined to the domestic sphere. They had few legal rights and little voice in society. Imagine a time when women couldn't vote, own property, or even control their own earnings. But even in these early days, seeds of change were being sown. Women like Hutchinson and Otis challenged traditional roles. They spoke out on matters of religion and politics. These brave voices planted the seeds for future generations of women to fight for their rights. The abolitionist movement of the 19th century provided fertile ground for the women's rights movement to take root. As women fought against slavery, they began to see the parallels with their own oppression. They realized that the fight for freedom and equality was interconnected. This realization fueled their determination to secure their own rights. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 marked a turning point. This gathering, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, issued a declaration of sentiments. This powerful document demanded equal rights for women, including the right to vote. It was a radical idea at the time, but it ignited a movement that would span generations. The fight for suffrage, the right to vote, became the central focus of the women's rights movement. Women like Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul dedicated their lives to this cause. They organized marches, lobbied politicians, and endured imprisonment and ridicule. Their tireless efforts slowly shifted public opinion. Finally, in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. This landmark achievement granted women the right to vote nationwide. It was a victory decades in the making, a testament to the unwavering spirit of the women who fought for it. But the fight for equality was far from over. The decades following suffrage saw a mix of progress and setbacks for women's rights. The Roaring Twenties brought about a loosening of social norms, with women entering the workforce in larger numbers and embracing new freedoms. However, this period also saw the rise of anti-feminist sentiment. Traditionalists felt threatened by the changing role of women. They argued that women's place was in the home, not in the public sphere. This backlash against feminism sought to maintain the status quo, pushing back against any further expansion of women's rights. The Great Depression of the 1930s further complicated the situation. As jobs became scarce, women were often pushed out of the workforce, seen as competition for men struggling to provide for their families. The economic hardship of the era made it difficult to advance the cause of women's rights. The 1960s and 70s witnessed a resurgence of feminist activism known as the Second Wave. This movement, inspired by the civil rights movement and the anti-war protests, sought to address a broader range of issues, including reproductive rights, equal pay, and violence against women. Betty Friedan's groundbreaking book, The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, gave voice to the dissatisfaction many women felt with their limited roles in society. It became a touchstone for the movement, sparking a national conversation about gender roles and expectations. The Second Wave saw the passage of landmark legislation, including the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, which prohibited sex discrimination in education. These were significant victories, but the fight for true equality was far from over. The gender pay gap, a persistent injustice. One of the most persistent challenges facing women in the United States is the gender pay gap. Despite decades of activism and legislation, women continue to earn less than men for comparable work. This disparity in earnings has far-reaching consequences for women and their families. The reasons for the pay gap are complex and multifaceted. They include occupational segregation, with women often concentrated in lower-paying fields, as well as discrimination and bias in hiring and promotion practices. The lack of affordable childcare also disproportionately affects women, forcing many to choose between their careers and caring for their families. Closing the gender pay gap requires a multi-pronged approach. This includes strengthening equal pay laws, promoting pay transparency, addressing occupational segregation, and providing affordable childcare options. It also requires challenging deeply ingrained societal norms and biases that undervalue women's work. Trailblazers, women who shaped the movement. Throughout the long struggle for women's rights, countless women have emerged as leaders, activists, and pioneers. These trailblazers have challenged the status quo, broken down barriers, and paved the way for future generations. Their courage and determination have been instrumental in advancing the cause of equality. From early suffragists like Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul to civil rights icons like Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer, these women have fought tirelessly for justice and equality. Their contributions have not only transformed the lives of women, but have also made America a more just and equitable society for all. The legacy of these trailblazers continues to inspire activists and advocates today. Their stories serve as a reminder that change is possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Their unwavering commitment to justice and equality serves as a beacon, guiding the path towards a more just and equitable future. The anti-feminist front resistance to change. The progress made by the women's rights movement has not gone unchallenged. Throughout history, there has been a persistent anti-feminist movement seeking to maintain traditional gender roles. This opposition has taken various forms, from overt discrimination to subtle attempts to undermine feminist goals. Anti-feminists argued that granting women equal rights would destroy society's fabric. They claimed women were inherently weaker and belonged in the home, not the public sphere. Today, anti-feminist sentiment often resists policies promoting gender equality, like affirmative action or paid family leave. Reproductive rights, a battlefield for control. One of the most contentious issues in the fight for women's rights has been the battle over reproductive rights. The ability to control one's own body and make decisions about reproduction is fundamental to women's autonomy and equality. However, access to safe and legal abortion has been under attack for decades. The landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision affirmed a woman's right to an abortion, but it also ignited a powerful anti-abortion movement. Opponents of abortion, often motivated by religious beliefs, view it as morally wrong and seek to restrict access to abortion services through legislation and legal challenges. The fight over reproductive rights is about much more than just abortion. It's about control over women's bodies and their ability to make decisions about their own lives. Restricting access to abortion disproportionately affects low-income women and women of color, who often face greater barriers to health care. Intersectionality, recognizing diverse experiences. As the women's rights movement has evolved, it has become increasingly important to recognize the diverse experiences of women from different backgrounds. Intersectionality, a term coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, acknowledges that people experience oppression and discrimination based on multiple and overlapping identities, such as race, class, gender identity, and sexual orientation. For example, Black women face unique challenges due to the intersection of sexism and racism. Similarly, LGBTQ+ women may experience discrimination based on both their gender identity and their sexual orientation. Recognizing these intersecting identities is crucial to understanding the complex ways in which oppression operates and to developing effective strategies for achieving equality. The concept of intersectionality has helped to broaden the scope of the women's rights movement to be more inclusive and responsive to the needs of all women. It acknowledges that there is no single woman's experience and that true equality requires addressing the systemic barriers that disproportionately affect marginalized groups. Progress and challenges, the landscape today. Despite significant progress, women in the U.S. still face challenges to full equality. They lag behind men in economic security, leadership, and freedom from violence. The gender pay gap persists, and women are underrepresented in leadership roles. Violence and discrimination remain serious issues. The fight for reproductive rights continues. Despite challenges, there is hope. The #MeToo movement has increased awareness and accountability. The unfinished revolution, looking ahead. The fight for women's rights is an ongoing struggle, a marathon, not a sprint. While we celebrate past victories, we must acknowledge the work that remains. The unfinished revolution for women's equality requires continued vigilance and activism. We must fight for economic justice, equal pay, and affordable childcare. Challenge gender stereotypes and promote women's leadership. Protect reproductive rights and ensure access to quality health care. The journey towards full equality is far from over. But with each generation, we move closer to realizing the dream of a world where all women are valued, respected, and empowered.